You're listening to Hoedown History, where we explore the history and legends of America's old time and bluegrass music.
This is called Squirrel Hunters.
It's one of those classic fiddle tunes that not only sounds cool, but it also has one of those awesome titles that's both a little mysterious and somewhat humorous. And I always wonder how much of a tune's popularity derives from its name. But the melody itself is a strong one too. It's a bit unique, what with landing on that 4 chord at the end of each part, giving it that slight tension right before the turnaround. And like many of my previous videos, this one too is popular in both the bluegrass and old-time genres. So stick around because we're going to explore the history of Squirrel Hunters. We'll learn where that title and the melody may have come from, and the people who helped popularize this tune as it's been handed down to us today. And yes, we will take a trip overseas to hear what may be our original source of the tune. But first, we'll need to explore one of the main sources of how this tune was preserved in America. And it's found in a region of the Appalachians that was often overlooked by many scholars and collectors of these old tunes. And even more interesting is the fact that it was commonly associated with an instrument that today is mostly forgotten of. And no, I'm not talking about the dulcimer. So let's dive in. Our story begins with this man, Samuel Bayard, and some of my listeners will be familiar with this name as he turns up repeatedly in my videos while researching these old tunes, but he's not as well known as some other more well-known folk music collectors as, say, Alan Lomax or Alan Jabor. But Bayard's contribution to American folk preservation is very significant. He was born in Pittsburgh in 1908. He came to know of the rich musical heritage in the Appalachian Hills, south of Pittsburgh, during his childhood visits to relatives who lived in the nearby Greene County, which sort of straddles the border with West Virginia. When he was just a teenager, he began to write down the many songs he heard in this part of the country. When Bayard later went on to attend Harvard and studied under the renowned folklorist George Lyman Kittredge, the professor was impressed with his collection of these old Greene County songs, and he encouraged Bayard to continue on in collecting these old tunes. After he graduated from Harvard and throughout the 1920s, Bayard began to travel throughout the other counties of southwestern Pennsylvania, visiting fiddlers, singers, and even fifers, carefully transcribing their music. And he continued to collect music up until the 1960s. But Bayard's interest in the music wasn't just academic. From the beginning of his nearly 40-year collection project, he recognized that there was a need for someone to save this musical heritage before it disappeared forever, and he knew that his time was running out. Some of Bayard's source musicians were already in their 70s and 80s at the time of his visits. They had learned these old tunes directly from previous generations who were born in the 1800s, who in turn inherited their music from the British Isles, and to a lesser extent, even Germany. The roots of these traditions had been carried over here by their ancestors, and new songs, tunes, and playing styles were eventually grafted on and shaped over generations, adapting to the rural Pennsylvania culture and developing into a distinct regional strain of North Appalachian music. When Bayard began collecting his tunes, folklorists were already somewhat active in other parts of Appalachia and other regions of the country. But most scholars didn't seem much interested in collecting or preserving the traditional music of Pennsylvania. The state was one of the most vulnerable to lose what it had, and Bayard was just kind of on his own. In the early era of commercial recording in the 1920s, he foresaw the inevitable disappearance of local music. The commercial recording industry was soon to put traditional music increasingly into the hands of professional recording artists who would go on to basically standardize it according to nationally broadcasted styles, but at the cost of preserving these more unique regional characteristics. In the early years of his project, roads in the hilly, heavily wooded southwestern counties of the state were largely unpaved and often impassable at various times of the year, leaving just narrow windows of time for visiting and collecting. The bulky recording equipment then available was out of the question for Baird, who either hitched rides or just traveled by foot. Fortunately, Baird was a man gifted from an early age with the ability to quickly memorize melodies. After hearing a tune, he would play it himself on his fife and then quickly transcribe it into musical notation. Earning the trust of these older musicians he came in contact with was a bit of a challenge for this Harvard educated scholar. Sometimes he would need to sit for several hours talking about everything under the sun with these old timers until eventually gaining their confidence that he wasn't some tax collector or some other intrusive government official. The Whiskey Rebellion of the 1790s still cast a long shadow in this area. Eventually, though, as the hours would pass, at some point, his host would abruptly declare, "Now, about those old tunes you were asking about." Once the rapport was established, he found the musicians actually as eager as he to preserve these old tunes for future generations. They would often work with him late into the night, taking pains to get the melodies and the lyrics correct, just as they learned them from their forebears. Few of Baird's sources were professional musicians, and none made a living playing their traditional tunes and songs. Most of these men and women were from just ordinary paths of life: farmers, gunsmiths, hunters, and coal miners, including one miner, Pete Province, who couldn't even play his fiddle anymore since he injured his left hand in a mining accident. Old Pete just whistled the old tunes from memory while Baird wrote them down. And another musician Baird met with was a fifer by the name of Hiram Clinton Horner of Westmoreland County. Horner was born in 1881. His father, grandfather, and great grandfather were all fifers from that region, likely extending the family's musical lineage back to colonial times. Baird visited Hiram in 1960 when Hiram was 80 years old, and one of the tunes that Baird collected from this man was entitled The Squirrel Hunters. Baird would eventually publish this tune that he heard from Hiram and several other Pennsylvania musicians in 1982 in a book entitled Dance to the Fiddle, March to the Fife. Here's a recording of the Squirrel Hunters being played by two members of the 21st Georgia Fife and Drum Corps to give you a feel of how this song sounds on fife and drum. And it's pretty cool. If you wondered why this tune has kind of that marchy feel to it, this is one reason. We in the bluegrass and old time scenes don't think too much about fifers and fife music much these days. But from America's colonial period up to the Civil War, the country, and in this case Pennsylvania, was full of local fife and drum ensembles. While mostly forgotten of today, fifers and drummers were once in great demand and played a big part in local events throughout the 1800s. They frequently played during patriotic holidays, but also funerals and even wedding day celebrations, where newlyweds were often welcomed back home with what Baird called a din of bells, gunshots, beaten metal tubs, firecrackers, and of course, fife and drum. And like the fiddlers of the time, Baird also noted how each fife player would also have their own individual and particular style. When asked how they kept the melody together while marching with all that variation, one fifer once explained to Baird, "Well, Sam, when everybody was busy having their innards blown out and drums backing them up, it wouldn't have made much of a difference." While I was researching all this fife music and its association with traditional folk music, I kept wondering why the fife kind of disappeared from much of old time music today. And there are a lot of theories out there to explain its disappearance. One reason given is that fifes are, well, just kind of loud. While tiny, they do pack a bit of a punch. They can sometimes be heard from as much as 3 miles away, which is why they were so effective in military operations. But another reason is that fifes and fiddles together have some pitch differences, and they also had some pretty different functions. For these reasons, it's quite unlikely that these two instruments were often played together. Maybe it's for these explanations why today no one brings a fife to an old time jam. Since Baird's time, however, this music of the fife and drum has been mostly idle and silent, resting quietly on the pages of his collections. Shout out, though, to my Civil War reenactor listeners who are trying to keep this tradition alive. But with the passing of Baird's individual sources, the last branch in this living musical lineage has pretty much passed away. Many of the tunes and songs in these collections have been almost fully forgotten. And I say almost because, well, as we all know, at least one of these tunes would go on to be rediscovered to find a new life. Which brings us to the next important person in our story. So let's leave Bayard for a minute and get to the next man most responsible for eventually reintroducing this tune to a wider world. The person we can thank for popularizing this tune in today's world is this man, the singer, songwriter, banjoist, fiddler, steamboat pilot, author, and record company producer, John Hartford. Hartford began playing music at an early age. His grandfather had an old fiddle that he used to saw around on when he was young, and even had a mandolin lent to him by one of his uncles. Early on, though, he started hearing the banjo, and he loved it. When he was still a young boy, he and his mother found an old banjo at a Goodwill. It was a Vega White Lady, plectrum. At first, he started playing it around with a flat pick. But then a neighbor who built fiddles figured out how to drill a hole in the neck to put a fifth string on it, and that was actually Hartford's first five string. For years, Hartford always wanted to be primarily a banjo player, his biggest role model being Earl Scruggs. Hartford said often that the first time he heard Earl Scruggs pick the banjo, it pretty much changed his life. But while the banjo would be his primary instrument during his early performance years, he never gave the fiddle up entirely. Even when he was playing mostly bluegrass styles in the early years, he always remembered a lot of the old-time tunes, and he always kept the fiddling up as well. But the fiddle was more like a second instrument. When Hartford eventually formed a groundbreaking group, one that helped fuel the fires of Newgrass to record his Aeroplane album in the early 70s, its members included the legendary Vassar Clements on fiddle. Clements kept the pressure up on Hartford to keep his bow rosined so that the two could play twin fiddles together. Vassar would always insist that Hartford should continue to play his fiddle more often. And over time, Hartford came to the realization that he really did love this instrument a lot. And he would go on to spend the next couple of decades really focusing on the fiddle. So it wasn't until much later in life that Hartford's son Jamie eventually taught John how to read music, which then helped open up some new doors. He started to really study these old fiddle tunes and where they came from and what made them tick. He started buying up every old fiddle tune book that he could find. And one of these collections that Hartford came across was this one, Samuel Baird's 1982 collection entitled Dance to the Fiddle, March to the Fife. And on page 174, there was a tune called the Squirrel Hunters. Now, why Hartford decided to pick up and learn this specific tune is shrouded by a bit of mystery. You'll recall from my video on the Cuckoo's Nest that Hartford was practically obsessed with the music of the legendary blind fiddler Ed Haley from West Virginia. Hartford went so far as to claim that Haley had the same impact on old-time fiddle playing that Earl Scruggs had on the banjo. According to Dan Carlin, Hartford was told by people who knew Haley that Haley did in fact occasionally play a tune called the Squirrel Hunters. But as far as I could find, there's no actual recording of Haley playing this tune. And we don't even know if Haley's Squirrel Hunters was the same melody as Baird's Squirrel Hunters. It may have been an entirely different piece of music, as there's a chance that the name could possibly be just one of those floating titles that vary from region to region. But regardless of his motivation, Hartford went on to learn this tune from Bayard's book, and he then taught it to his bandmates. And it eventually wound up as the opening track for his 1996 Rounder Records CD entitled Wild Hog in the Brush, and a bunch of others you might not have heard. A year or so after this recording was made, the Squirrel Hunters would go on to be a special piece for Hartford that he would always use to start or end most of his shows with. So here's a live performance of Hartford I dug up playing Squirrel Hunters during one of his shows. Apologies for the poor video quality, but it's still a great piece.
This is a Squirrel Hunter.
Since the mid-90s, Hartford's performance of the Squirrel Hunters, that old Fife tune that he dug up from Bayard's collection, has attracted many other bluegrass musicians to perform it as well, notably with Special Consensus, Adam Steffi, and the Traveling McCourys. I'll play a cut from the Traveling McCourys. You'll notice that while Hartford's version has this sort of pensive, laid-back swing, and he does seem to hold those notes out for as long as he can, which lends it that certain groove, the McCourys will play it with more of that good old hard-hitting bluegrass drive. And I just love Jason Carter's break on this one, taking some liberties with the melody and just going all out there. So while we can credit John Hartford for reviving and popularizing this old and mostly forgotten tune, it wasn't actually completely forgotten. In fact, some old-time musicians have claimed that this tune would sometimes come up at jam sessions during the 80s and 90s before Hartford even released his recording. It just wasn't called the Squirrel Hunters. When Bayard collected his versions of this tune, he found it under several different titles, depending on region and performer. Other names include Squirrel Hunting, We'll All Take Tea, The Bell Cow, Dilly's Favorite, and more others. And the tune itself had actually already been recorded by fiddlers before Hartford picked it up. It went by some names that Bayard hadn't even come across. The first one I'll mention is this one, Rainy Day, which was played and recorded by Melvin Wine of West Virginia. Melvin grew up playing the fiddle at an early age and played for numerous square dances, fairs, and even silent movies. But during the late 1930s, he put aside his fiddling after a religious conversion prompted him to step away from the rough and tumble square dance scene, which could frequently get out of hand. But during the folk revival of the 50s and 60s, he reluctantly picked up his fiddle to play in some contests. During the 70s, when Wine was in his 60s, Alan Jabbour found him and made some recordings for an LP. Here's Melvin Wine playing The Rainy Day, and it does sound remarkably like our Squirrel Hunters. And you have to love Wine's fiddling style. He plays this one in A modal, but it doesn't actually sound too dark. That's kind of the genius of his fiddling. There's something about his style that sounds both dark and happy at the same time. Give it a listen. To my ears, the two pieces do sound related. The B part is basically identical, but the A part may be stretching it a bit. I also need to quickly mention another title of what appears to be pretty much the same tune as Squirrel Hunters as well. It was entitled Dan Friend's Piece. And here's a recording of Ernie Carpenter from West Virginia. And this is one that just raises the hairs on the back of your neck. So it's pretty clear that this tune was floating around in some of the old-time circles before Hartford rediscovered it. But interesting enough, it was Hartford's version and title that would in fact be the one that would lead to this melody's revival in the old-time world as well. And it was Hartford's version, because while Bayard recorded multiple versions of this tune, Hartford appears to have borrowed from several of these versions to compose his own unique take. And of course, let's be honest, some of the reason for his version's popularity can be attributed to his use of the Squirrel Hunters title, which is a bit more catchy than Rainy Day or Dan Friend's Piece. Speaking of alternate titles, we should probably discuss where the title comes from, or at least the theory of where it comes from. In early September of 1862, the Civil War was in its second year, and Confederate forces were on the move northward. Southern troops had just captured Lexington, Kentucky, and were making a move to capture nearby Covington, Kentucky, as well as the city across the Ohio River, Cincinnati, which was then the seventh largest city in the United States. If the Confederates proved successful, it would be the first invasion of the South into Ohio. In anticipation of a Confederate assault, General Lewis Wallace was given orders to prepare Covington and Cincinnati's defenses. Once in Cincinnati, the general moved quickly to declare martial law. Local business owners were ordered to close up their shops, and an urgent call was put out in Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan for a 30 to 90-day call-up of a militia in defense of Cincinnati and the Ohio border. They were commanded to build a series of defensive trenches in order to prepare the two towns for the attack. A number of Ohio counties offered their men for the defense of Cincinnati, an offer which the Union Army accepted immediately, but under the stipulation that only armed men would be allowed to join. Within just 2 days, 14,000 of these volunteers from 65 counties converged on Cincinnati to report for duty. But many of these men had no actual previous military experience, and the weapons they brought were quite a bit outdated, more suited to small game hunting than all-out combat. And so these men would soon earn the enduring nickname of the Squirrel Hunters. Between these Squirrel Hunter volunteers and the regular army, the North had a force of about 70,000 men along the border. And at dawn on September 10th, General Heth arrived with his 8,000 battle-hardened Confederate troops and established a camp near the border. During these tense hours, the two opposing generals actually looked at each other through their field glasses. A Confederate scout, upon seeing the volunteers, is reported to have said, quote, "They call them squirrel hunters, farm boys that never had to shoot at the same squirrel twice." It was a day filled with tension and anticipation, but not much else actually happened, either that day or the next. And as quickly as they appeared, the Confederates were gone, leaving sometime in the darkness of the night of September 11th. The Confederates eventually realized they were vastly outnumbered and were summoned back south. When word got out that the enemy forces had withdrawn and the city was no longer in danger, cheers broke out throughout Cincinnati. The streets were jammed, national emblems appeared everywhere, and families welcomed back their patriotic citizen soldiers. And without much fuss, the Squirrel Hunters returned to their homes and livelihoods. The following year, as a show of thanks, the Ohio legislature even authorized funds to print discharges for these men. And that funny-sounding nickname became somewhat of an official title, because on these discharge papers was written the following: "The people of the state of Ohio owe a debt of deep gratitude to the Squirrel Hunters, who who, by their prompt response, saved the cities and towns upon the southern border from the fire and sword of the enemies of our glorious government. So, that's the most popular theory of where the title of our tune comes from. But it's just a theory, as there's no actual evidence to suggest the name of our tune was based on this military group, but it is a highly likely possibility, and it's a pretty cool story. And while the title may have originated in the 1800s to commemorate this group of soldiers, we know the tune itself is actually much older than that. And to trace the source of this melody, we need to get back to Bayard. Bayard's knowledge of musical sources was impressive, to say the least. He was known to ask people, "What's your favorite folk or gospel song?" And after a reply was given, he would usually respond with something like, "Oh, yeah, that melody comes from an old Scottish tune from the 1600s called," and he would rattle something off in Gaelic. Bayard stated in his book that Squirrel Hunters is actually part of a large tune family that also includes a whole slew of Irish and Scottish relatives. But there were too many numbers in this tune family to make any one direct link. He found some of these possible sources not just in 2/4 and 4/4 time, but some in 6/8 and 3/4 time as well, which all points to the fact that the melody was a popular one throughout the British Isles and Ireland. One possible source he did mention was the Scottish tune entitled The Oyster Wives' Rant, which can be found in manuscripts as far back as the mid 1700s. And he also mentioned the Hawes of Cromdale, a Scottish tune that shows up on manuscripts as far back as the 1780s. But probably the strongest resemblance is found in the popular Old Irish tune called The Pigeon on the Gatepost. Give it a listen. Obviously, the two are related, and this pigeon tune was, and still is, very popular in Cape Breton and Prince Edward Island as well. So there you have it, folks. What appears to be an old British Isles tune that was brought over to the settlers in the Pennsylvania hills, passed down from generation to generation as a fife and drum tune named after some small game hunters in Ohio, that was thankfully written down by a Harvard professor from Pittsburgh in a book that would eventually be picked up by a legendary bluegrass artist. So that's all I got on Squirrel Hunters. Hope you enjoyed this one, and thanks for watching.
This is a Squirrel Hunter.